Let's talk about the arts of silence, and let's start with the start of silence. I like euphemisms and cliches like let's start at the beginning, or the natural place to begin is X, Y, or Z, because no matter how overused these phrases are, they retain an inner magic. It's often hidden, but it's always there. That magic is where possibility and impossibility meet. As Samuel Beckett's plays demonstrate, it's impossible to begin, but all we can do is to keep beginning. And likewise for endings. After long ramblings, Beckett ends by continuing, I can't go on. I can't go on. I'll go on. Philosophers know this too. For all Nietzsche's grand claims about splitting the history of philosophy in two, he has moments of humility where he admits, I would not have been possible without Kant. So, starting at the beginning always involves some sleight of hand, some chicanery. Take, for example, the conventional blues opening.
I woke up this morning.
We get grabbed by the ear and raced along. All this before we can ask, what happened the night before? It's a sonic device closely analogous to the folklore and fairy tale opening Once Upon a Time. These are performances or speech acts which catch us very swiftly and very efficiently. For all its ancient authority, even the Bereshit, the beginning of the beginning in Genesis, functions as a hustle. It announces an opening by creating an illusion that all that came before it was silence, just as the noisiest barroom can be retrofitted with the illusion of silence by the piano opening. Oh! But if we hold back our attention just a little, we can see and hear the magic trick as a trick. Even small children will ask, what was God doing before the beginning? Was he lonely? Was he in the dark? Was there no one to talk to? This response to the idea of a silence before the first word or noise is not limited to children. Most of us have questions for the cosmologists about what happened before the Big Bang. When we are told that there was no before, because there was no space-time, we suspect shenanigans. Why? Because the idea of an infinite and total silence before the Big Bang is not only narratively repugnant to most of us, it's literally devoid of sense. What is a blind and deaf universe under the most general anesthetics, doing nothing, not even waiting to exist? What is it? It is nonsense. So, when we hear the words, in the beginning, or some physicists reasoning for the Big Bang, or we hear the our attention is put to work in a very specific way, something like selecting the temporal gear in which the vehicle must get rolling, or else it will stall. We're slipping the clutch of our credulity. Whenever a front end to silence or a beginning of meaning is announced, we know that somebody wrote that language, or some cosmologist applied that mathematics, and somebody made that piano out of wood and metal long before a performer hammered out the... To be blunt, even if the opening is announced as the eternal word of God, part of us always knows that this is staged. This makes it difficult, but still kind of necessary to think about the beginning of silence. If it was all silence until God spoke being into existence, then when did God's silence begin? Inasmuch as silence abides with God, and the silence is also consonant with a cosmos devoid of God, there is something doubly sacred about silence. Sacred, sacere, set apart. And silence is set apart from existence. It's not just a non-sound, it's the negation of all existing sounds. Silence, if it existed, which it doesn't, would function like the fool in the tarot deck, card 0, or the joker in a conventional card deck which can assume the value of any other card. Silence is profoundly related to jokes and laughter.
Hear that? No, me neither. What was it? Nothing.
Silence can be like anything because it is like nothing. So when the psychologist Paul Goodman talks of 9 kinds of silence, he is, to my mind, being as mean as the people who say that we have 5 and only 5 senses. I'm more inclined towards an active and infinitely fertile nothing, a silence which negates even itself and so can speak in a zillion ways between any 2 notes or words or things. We get the word alphabet from the opening letter of the Hebrew, Aleph Bet. The role of silence is thoroughly explored in Kabbalistic thinking about the role of the Aleph, the first and the most silent of letters. But even in the notation for the silent letter, there's a compulsion to tell stories about its origins and meanings. The beginning of the Aleph Bet is said to silently indicate the division of the upper and lower waters in Genesis. The Aleph was later interpreted as a sigil for the Hermetic principle, as above, so below, as below, so above. Some centuries later, esoteric Trinitarians hitched a ride on its silence, interpreting the 3 strokes of one letter as symbols for the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It seems that the Aleph, the very image of silence, speaks in as many ways as it has readers. If we can find no silence in the letters and narrative devices for silence, might we find silence in music? This seems at first hearing a more natural home. Let's go straight to John Cage, who's celebrated or derided for his famous piece 4 minutes 33 seconds. This is often thought of as the archetypal instance of silent music. I think the piece is more about duration than silence, for Cage often claimed that duration was the most fundamental building block of his music because it's shared by both sound and silence. And Cage was not the first composer to use relatively long silences as a structural element of his music. In the late 1890s, Alphonse Allais wrote a silent piece called Funeral March for a Deaf Man, and people like Erwin Schurhoff and Yves Klein both had pieces which included lengthy sections where no notes were sounded. In more popular terms, we might think of somebody like Erik Satie, his work certainly has a strong tendency towards silence. And that tendency is as much as we can ask, for in strictly sonic terms, we never get to silence. In his book Silence, Cage documents his visit to an anechoic chamber, a sealed room which, for the human ear, is the equivalent of a sack of 6 midnights at the bottom of a coal mine. But even in these most soundproof conditions, Cage could still hear 2 distinct tones, the high whistle of his own nervous system and the bass rumble of his blood. Silence is impossible, at least for the living, and it might be impossible for the dead for other reasons. Although silence in this sense is impossible, Cage thought it was fundamental to music and often said that he considered 4 minutes 33 seconds to be his most important composition. Interestingly, an early title for the piece that he used was Silent Prayer. I've talked in other places about the different qualities of nothingness and how we all make distinctions between different qualities and different kinds of negation. For example, the feeling of no feeling in your fingers when you've slept on your arm and you wake up and your hand has kind of joined the ranks of the living dead. It's like uncanny and horribly numb, like some sort of conjoined pork chop. And we kind of laugh at that sort of sensation or non-sensation. We laugh our way through the numbness until the pain and the pins and needles start. But there's something, I think, linked here to the way we frequently laugh about hearing of death. Often described as a nervous laugh or an automatic reaction. But we laugh at these black holes in the world. These black holes in sensation. Here's the audience reaction to the psychologist Paul Bloom again. His comments in a TEDx lecture on
John Cage's modernist composition, 4 minutes, 33 seconds. As many of you know, this is a composition where the pianist sits at a bench, opens up the piano, and sits and does nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, that period of silence. And people have different views on this, but what I want to point out is, you can buy this from iTunes. For $1.99, you could listen to that silence, which is different than other forms of silence.
Now, these people laughing are not naive, disbelieving peasants who think that all music should be danceable. These are cultured bourgeois intellectuals at a TEDx talk. That they would recognize works by Duchamp and Beckett and Rothko. These are precisely the types who are meant to get this kind of high culture. And still they laugh, like it's a music hall joke. I must do another session to explore the links between silence, laughter, and madness. If $1.99 for silence is laughable, then what are we to make of Rothko's painting, Red, Orange, Red, a large and gorgeous piece of silence, which sold for $3.4 million in 2009? Or Robert Rauschenberg's series of entirely white paintings, also exorbitantly expensive, and which John Cage cited as a direct influence on his composition of 433. The San Francisco Museum of Modern Art says this about Rauschenberg's pure white canvases. In 1961, composer John Cage famously referred to the white paintings as airports for lights, shadows, and particles, establishing an enduring understanding of the series as receptive surfaces that respond to the world around them. Building on this reading, Rauschenberg once referred to the works as clocks, saying that if one was sensitive enough to the subtle changes on their surfaces, one could tell the time and what the weather was like outside. Ultimately, the power of the white paintings resides in the shifts in attention they require from the viewer, asking us to slow down, watch closely over time, and inspect their mute painted surfaces for subtle shifts in colour, light, and texture. End of quote. Rothko's large and entirely black paintings of 1964, a series of 14 of them, are hung in a chapel, of course. Nothingness, which is not uniformly nothing. Blackness, which is not uniformly black. Silence, which is never quite itself. It's very easy to dismiss all this as a mystification, a swindle, a doomed attempt to F the ineffable. But even if all of this, orbiting the hole from which no sense or signal can emerge, even if it is a pose or mystification, it's such a general swindle that it surely signifies something. I'm very suspicious of claims about cultural universals and would not say that we found a cultural universal here in attitudes to silence, but there is a remarkably widespread awareness of the holiness of silence. 3 minutes silence for the dead. The silence of the Tao, which does nothing, but through it all things are done. The silence of Xlotl, the unformed god of the Aztecs. And there are Christian and Zen Buddhist and Gnostic and Hindu variations over many centuries, many continents, with techniques for exploring the sacred mysteries of silence. And of course, there are worlds of eroticism in silence. Even for the most unregenerate of atheists, there is something prayerful about the intimacy of being silent with somebody, the specific sense of sharing our speechlessness. And unless we're tempted to romanticize silence too much, we should mention here the awful, threatening silences, and the silences which move like monoliths or glaciers, the silences which drive people to such extremes of isolation that suicide is a luxury they can afford. As a writer and musician, there are practical exercises I use for working with silence. I speak a lot, I write a lot, I make a lot of noise, I make music, but I very much see myself as a silence worker, or at least as somebody constantly working in the shadow of silence. There are two practices I'd like to share at some point, not least with people who I could compare. Let's see if we get similar results. Again, this is where there's a fork in the road between theory as speech and the practices of aesthetics. Talking about silence in the arts is not pointless, but as I've said elsewhere, thinking about the arts can take us some way. But like thinking about swimming, it doesn't get us off the island and into the depths of the silent waters. Some people are better at talking about silence than others. For the theoretically inclined, I would really recommend Susan Sontag's 1969 essay, The Aesthetics of Silence, which is great until she starts to commute differences and paradoxes for dialectics. Sontag writes, "Just as there can't be up without down or left without right, someone must acknowledge a surrounding environment of sound or language in order to recognize silence. A genuine emptiness, a pure silence, is not feasible, either conceptually or in fact." And so far I'm nodding my head, but then she writes, "If only because the artwork exists in a world furnished with many other things, the artist who creates silence or emptiness must produce something dialectical, a full void, an enriching emptiness, a resonating or eloquent silence. Silence remains inescapably a form of speech, in many instances of complaint or indictment, and an element in a dialogue." If you want to go down that route with Sontag, there's an excellent account of the essay on Maria Popova's site, Brain Pickings. But I feel there's something more sinister than dialectics, or a form of speech at stake, when we talk of the idea that silence is inescapably part of a dialogue. I think that tilts the table too far. It rigs the game in favour of language. I mean, silence is not a point one arrives at, like the North Pole. And just thinking about it spatially, it's not a point like the North Pole, it's a direction of travel like west, which that lures us further into the night, like following the vanishing sun. I mean, the impossibility of silence is probably a large part of what recommends it as an aim for mystics and artists. I've long suspected that the social convention of applause at the end of a piece of music, serves several functions, one of which is, of course, an appreciation. I think it's something else. I think it also functions as a kind of amputation, a way of cutting things off, or maybe even an assassination. I think you can sometimes hear it as an attempt to drown out the newborn silence at the end of a piece of work, an attempt to drown out something which we might be overpowered by or fearful of or uncomfortable with. It's not like dialectics. It's perhaps a fear that the silence might learn to speak about what the music has said, perhaps about what the music could not say. Yeah, I'd like to end there if I could, but I probably can't. I can't go on. But I mean, I will go on, because when I stop, you'll be listening towards the silence then. Probably for a long time. Which I hope is helpful. To you.